Good morning, Watershed, and Merry almost Christmas. If you're new in this space, let me welcome you and introduce myself. My name is Shawn, and I'm billed as a teaching pastor. I'm one of a group of 5 people on any given Sunday who talk up here. Truly, though, I prefer to call myself a storyteller. I think it's a better fit. I'm a creative writer. I teach writing at a local university here, but also historically, storytellers and story keepers have a rich tradition in indigenous cultures. And as a Costa Rican woman, I sort of claim that heritage. So I prefer storyteller than teaching pastor. It seems a little more gentle also. I am a story keeper, but a lot of the stories of my culture have been kept hidden or are really grossly underplayed. And I've talked a lot about decolonizing my faith before, but I don't think I've explained what I mean by that. When I use the term decolonization, I refer to pulling at the thread of my past, my heritage that I have always felt pulsing within my veins. I grew up Catholic. I don't know that comes as much of a surprise. Over 75% of Costa Ricans are practicing Catholics, and Catholicism in Latin America has very deep and very troubling roots that span all the way across the ocean to Spain. My faith is inherited from my colonial oppressor. My native tongue of Spanish is also gifted to me by my oppressor. The indigenous tongues of my antepasados, my ancestors, were brutally cut out. So my religious identity is a relationship best labeled as complicated. I work to hold the ambiguity, the tension of loving a Jesus that was introduced to me by an abuser. I work to hold the duality that my faith is rooted in systems of oppression, but also informed by indigenous wisdom. Mine is borderland faith, one foot planted in 2 very different landscapes. I have the privileged Eurocentric Christian perspective and the marginalized faith of my indigenous ancestors. They both run through my veins. And in my quest to decolonize my religion, I've studied indigenous faith and wisdom. I have visited sacred Mayan and Aztec sites. I have witnessed and participated in Mayan ceremonies, and I've done a lot of research. Modern story keepers are researchers, after all, driven by passion to unearth the stories that tell us who we are, driven to know our native lands before they were claimed. But listen, I also love the sanctity and traditions of Catholicism. I love the stories of martyred saints who, for me, are far more authentic heroes than any masked crusader hero could be. But I think what I love most of all is the Virgin Mary. Most of Latino America is a matriarchal society, despite pushing against toxic masculinity that parades around the label of machismo. Family is sacrosanct in Costa Rica, and the nucleus of that is the woman. The mother, the giver and sustainer of life. It is la madre who holds the center. So you know we love our Virgencitas, our Virgin Marys. And the most iconic of those is La Virgen de Guadalupe. She's adorned in a regal cloak of pinprick stars, standing on a crescent moon held up by a sweet cherub and radiating an entire golden aura instead of a modest halo. This depiction of Mother Mary, hopefully it's on the screen here soon, is one of power and opulence. But for all that regal glory, the Virgin Mary appeared to a peasant. Mary spoke to Juan Diego in his native Aztec tongue of Nahuatl. This image of her is synonymous for Mexico and Central America and is as much a cultural symbol as it is a religious one. I grew up with posters of this image, like maybe In Sync would be a poster and like a white counterpart friend of mine, but I had like the Virgin Mary or the Sacred Heart of Jesus, literally a poster above my bed. It was so cool. So the Virgin Mary was important to us, right? I had images of her. I had little statue replicas. Along with the rosary and the crucifix, it was perhaps the most common relic of my faith growing up. Catholics grow up with Virgin Mary. She is just a commonplace fixture in our lives. Her shrine at the Basilica in Mexico City is the third most visited sacred site in the world. That she chose an indigenous peasant to bear her message is significant. That she spoke the language of the oppressed, of the indigenous, is significant. The Virgen de Guadalupe embraces duality by her very origin story. And of course, I have an incredible soft spot for her because her celebrated feast day was this Monday, December 12th. And many of you know that I have twin boys. They were due in early January, and every doctor, every nurse, every medical professional, every woman over 50 told me that I was gonna have those babies in December and not like January 7th, which was their due date. And at my 37-week appointment, I was admitted into the hospital to be induced, and I remember calling my parents, and my mom was just beaming. I could hear it over the phone, the excitement in her voice. She said, maybe you'll have them on the feast day of the Virgin Mary. And I was like, I don't think it works that way. So I laughed. But then two and a half days later, the boys appeared on 12/12/12, the Virgin Feast Day of the Virgin Mary. And I can't help but feel cosmically connected to her now because of that. And when I think about the events that unfolded just after their birth, we had a really scary incident with one of our sons. I can't help but consider the Virgen de Guadalupe a protector for my boys. And I'll be honest, growing up, I never understood the criticism that Catholics worship saints and Mary. We venerate them, totally. I don't think that's the same thing, though. Veneration is about deep and abiding respect. But consider this, the establishment of the church was the one to ascribe a patriarchal bent to God in the first place. With God as a stern ruler casting judgment from some lofty throne, it's no wonder we flock to a mother figure. For Catholics, Mary is a mediator, a gentle, nurturing go-between. Mother Mary provides us with feminine imagery and language to describe the divine. She's maternal, she's compassionate, life-giving, caring, loving. These very traits describe God too, though, do they not? So in this way, those who embrace Mary embrace the plurality of God. In an essay written by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, co-founder and co-editor of the Journalist of Feminist Studies in Religion, there is this nugget of wisdom. She says, the Christian language about God has to transcend patriarchal as well as matriarchal language and symbols, while at the same time employing a variety of human expressions to reflect a pluriformity of human experiences. In other words, transcending both masculine and feminine doesn't mean to reject either, but to accept both, and a myriad of other human dimensions as part of the divine. Throughout the world, there are countless depictions of Virgin Mary, perhaps thousands and thousands of Madonnas, all with their unique stories and feast days, all projecting a feminine understanding of God. But Black Madonnas, those are rare. In fact, there are only an estimated 500 around the world. Costa Rica's Virgin Mary is one of those Black Madonnas, and her story is fascinating to me, not least because it epitomizes the borderland faith I feel so drawn to. She is known now as La Virgen de los Ángeles, Virgin of the Angels, but before that, she had another name. She was affectionately called La Negrita, a term that translates to little black one. To our American ears, we might cringe at this, but this was a term of endearment spoken with much reverence. La Negrita, by her very essence, asks me to embrace the duality of contradiction. She asks me to abide in ambiguity. So here's her story. In 1635, a young woman, by some accounts a girl, was walking through the forest and came across a small, dark-colored stone of a mother holding a child. The child had one palm placed on his mother's chest, and as the story goes, the young woman brought the miniature statue home. But the statue kept reappearing in the same spot in the forest the very next day. So the women decided to consult the local Catholic priest, and the icon, by now recognized as the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, was placed in a box in the church for safekeeping, under lock and key. But again, the little Mary reappeared in the woods the next day. This account of the miraculous appearance of the Virgin Mary isn't so different from other apparition stories around the globe, and yet it's a unique story, and here's why. First, the Virgin Mary is made of black stone and clearly a Black Madonna by her features. The second remarkable part of this story is the young woman to whom La Negrita appears. The young woman came from Puebla de los Pardos. The term pardo meant free black person. Puebla de los Pardos, then, was a town or a barrio or a neighborhood designated for free blacks on the outskirts of the colonial city of Cartago in Costa Rica. This young woman was of African descent, living in colonial Costa Rica under the rule of the Spanish crown. Colonial Costa Rica had indentured servants, but the slave trade there never really took a strong foothold. Slavery was a really expensive enterprise, and at the time, Costa Rica was underdeveloped and poor compared to its other Central American neighbors. Thus, the country was largely ignored by Spain, and many Africans were able to purchase their freedom. Sorry, turning the page. I'm really a storyteller. They were able to earn their freedom, and they earned money by working on cacao plantations. Of course, this does not at all diminish the horrors of slavery, nor does it pardon any violence. But in much of the New World in the 1600s, slavery was the primary means of labor on plantations. So in many ways, a settlement of free blacks in 1635 is rare, especially since slavery wasn't abolished until 1824, 3 years after Costa Rica won its independence from Spain. You didn't know you were going to get a little history lesson today, did you? But listen, a Black Virgin Mary appears to a woman of Afro descent. Many African free men married indigenous Costa Rican women, so our young woman of African descent likely had indigeneity of both Costa Rican and African indigenous tribes. The layers of contradiction, of duality, are so clearly displayed. The mother of Jesus is for all, and that she would appear to an indigenous woman who, even though free, would have been marginalized is profound. There's a priest in the story, remember? After La Negrita keeps escaping and reappearing in Pueblo de los Prado woods, he decides the Virgin Mary obviously belongs among her people. So he commissions a church to be built for La Negrita, where she was found. A couple of years later, the Catholic bishop establishes La Confradia, a lay group of free blacks tasked with maintaining and venerating this really precious statue. So for 200 years, this Black Madonna would peacefully abide in this community among people of Afro descent mixed with indigenous and Spanish blood, no doubt. I've seen Mayan ceremonies. I have read about African rituals, ceremonies of the Asante, the Yoruba, and other tribes. I can only imagine the celebrations this community held to honor their Black mother. It would have been a blend of indigenous sacred rituals. It would likely incorporate sacred practice and ancient wisdom, dancing and singing, and likely, under the gaze of any colonial Spaniard, it would have been misunderstood too, perhaps even mischaracterized. But for 200 years, La Negrita was revered and celebrated exclusively by a marginal community. It was only during the fight for independence from Spain that the church stole, the Black Madonna from the Pardos. She was taken to the basilica in Cartago and there renamed La Virgen de los Ángeles, Virgin of the Angels. Of course, there's irony here. The Catholic Church was the oppressor in many ways, and the Spanish king sent forth a horde of conquistadors to claim new territories for the crown and for God. Native tongues were taught to worship different gods in different languages. Indigenous peoples were slaughtered or stripped of their identities and forced into submission. Any Catholic symbol could easily and often did become synonymous with the power of malicious empires. And yet, a small Black Mary, nestling her Black son, was found by a Black woman, a woman with no name, in a Black part of town. In the story of Jesus, it is women who hold the center. Writer of Black liturgies Cole Arthur Riley says this: "Pay attention to the silence of the men in the Christmas story. Zechariah can't speak. Joseph doesn't speak, while the words and emotions of Mary and Elizabeth take their rightful place. The sound of Advent is the voice of women. Silence is divine recentering." The sound of Advent is the voice of women. I imagine Mary's labor, how she would have called out, how her voice might sound in the hollow of a barn, how the silence would envelop her too, recenter her. And let's take a minute here on her precious son. Shortly after the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph flee Judea to Egypt. They are Jewish refugees who leave their homeland in fear of persecution and death. They narrowly escape King Herod's horrific massacre. How can we read the story of Jesus' birth and the start of his life and not acknowledge that if we are true followers of Christ, then we must be called to love the stranger, the immigrant, the other? The nativity story is one of resistance. His very birth defies the ruling power. Another Black woman I follow, Marcy Alvis Walker, says it this way: "This Christmas story comes from the occupied, not the conqueror. This story comes from the unheard, not the praised. This story comes from the disregarded, not the revered. It comes from the undocumented, the browbeaten. This story comes from the underprivileged, not the affluent. This story comes from the despised, not the favored." I don't know if you know this, but Jesus' birth is not a Christian story, after all. It's a Jewish one. Over and over and over again in the life story of Mary, in the glimpses that we get of it anyway, we see a woman who lives in marginal spaces. It doesn't surprise me at all that she chooses to appear to those in society that society would deem inferior: the peasants and the outcasts, the misfits, the have-nots. An institution can use her image as a symbol of power in the same way they can use the cross as an icon of superiority. But the entities those symbols represent defy such toxic power. I grew up with the rule, don't use God's name in vain. And what it meant was that it banned the phrase, "oh my God," in my house, or any variation of that. You would definitely never say GD, right? I see that differently now. Don't use God's name in vain. Using the Lord's name in vain, I think that's certain churches justifying all manner of hatred under the name of God. It's vanity and pride that comes with superiority that has forgotten the story of baby Jesus, of the pregnancy of an unwed mother, of a refugee family living in a foreign land, of a baby would-be king who is in fact not white. In this story, I see a reclamation. I see a holy figure that crosses borders, theologies, that embraces contradictions and reveals herself to the most humble among us. And why not? In fact, nothing makes more sense to me. The Mary we encounter in the Gospels is a young woman. She's a girl, perhaps not much different from the Costa Rican indigenous woman of our story. I want to visit Mary's words from the Gospel of Luke, and for context, she's gone to visit her relative Elizabeth, and the two women greet each other with overwhelming joy. And this is the part where the men are silent. Joseph doesn't speak, Zechariah can't speak, but Mary says this, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has looked on the humble estate of his servant. For behold, from now on, all generations will call me blessed. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in their thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his offspring forever." In this passage, Mary depicts a humility and servanthood, a poverty that also describes the indigenous woman who discovered her icon in those woods. And in this very same passage, Mary addresses the fate of the oppressors. They shall fall from their thrones. Who is this Mary for, I ask you? Is she for the crown? The colonial empire? The Spanish conquistador? No. She's for the humble, for the meek, for the women of history whose stories are buried, whose names are forgotten. Mary, who delivered her son, Savior in the world, in a barn amongst the livestock. Of course she connects to the descendants of the enslaved. Of course she connects with the outcasts, the marginalized, the misunderstood. Last week, Kim talked about this very thing, about the many, many women of the Bible and in history who go unnamed, who are silenced or made to be the side characters. In this moving scene, Mary and Elizabeth's poignant dialogue is centered in the text, which is pretty remarkable. Just before the passage we read, Elizabeth had greeted Mary first, calling her blessed among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. Those lines of exaltation have become a critical part of the Rosary prayer, which is a keystone practice for many, many Catholics. And in this scene, it is the women who are the principal characters, women who are telling the good news. And for the record, Jesus' life and resurrection are bookended by parallel storylines. Angels appear first to women, and women believe. They don't ask for proof. They just believe. It is the men in these stories that need convincing. When the women tell the disciples about the empty tomb, the women are dismissed, their testimony considered false talk. When Joseph discovers Mary is pregnant, he plans to quietly dismiss her to save her from public disgrace. So nice. It takes an angel to convince him otherwise. Parallel storylines, women holding the center. So when Mary keeps showing up in the native places of the antepasados who are not in fact part of the ruling class, I see that as an invitation. When Mary reveals herself in the form of an indigenous woman to a woman of indigenous descent, I see myself reflected too. We can weaponize religious iconography all we want. Mother Mary, Jesus, they find a way to be with their people, to embrace with abundant love what has been outcast. Do you guys want to meet La Negrita? I've got some pictures. There's going to be some photos here. So this is the stone, how it would have appeared in the woods. And she's little. And so once she got to the basilica in Cartago, they added a lot of opulent gold adornments. I think that was added when she reached the cathedral. I sort of, there you can see it, right? The ornateness of it. I prefer the simplicity of how she originally appeared. I find comfort in the roundness of her body, in her maternal care. She's made of rock. Some say the icon is a blend of the jade that Costa Rica is famous for and volcanic rock that also punctuates the architecture of my beloved homeland. She simultaneously connects me to the landscape of my identity, to the motherland, and reminds me of the universality of matriarchal love. This is the fourth Sunday in Advent. And if you follow the liturgical calendar, Advent marks the beginning of the new year in the Christian faith. Advent, which comes from the Latin adventus, means coming. By now, Mary had started her long, arduous journey to Bethlehem. By now, the birth of Jesus was close at hand. In 2021, as many of you know, I lost 3 matriarchs in my life. First, my paternal grandmother, then my abuela, and then shockingly, my own mother. I cannot express the comfort the Virgin Mary brings me in the absence of my most immediate mother figures. Part of the Virgen de Guadalupe story talks about Juan Diego rushing home to take care of a sick relative. Mary appears to him and she says, "Am I not here? I who am your mother?" She was gently chastising him for not seeking her divine help. And this phrase is forever memorialized because it's actually carved into the basilica's entrance. Am I not here? I who am your mother. These words are a salve. Mary, she's for everyone. She offers her mother's love to us all. I am grateful for new beginnings that unfold in the most humble of ways. The unimposing icon of La Negrita, the simplicity of her story, and the simple woman she appeared to, the unassuming, humble birth of Jesus, the soft way they accompany us, the way they cross time and space and borders, the way they embody contradiction to reorder the world and make it new. Watershed. The good news inherent in the birth of Jesus is indeed close at hand. As we leave this space this morning, I pray we carry this Advent truth with us. May we learn to embrace the ambiguity that is present in our lives. May we learn to love like Jesus and Mary. May we understand the good news isn't possible without the resilience and tenderness of a woman. Gosh, if not for a woman. If not for my grandmothers. If not for my mom. If not for an indigenous ancestor. And my God, if not for a Black Madonna. Amen.